ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamer.com video. Let's discuss digital pricing on the PC, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. It's a fairly poignant topic, as particularly in this next generation, when developers and publishers, as well as platform creators, in other words Sony and Microsoft specifically, expect us more and more to go towards the digital medium, and yet prices simply, on average, do not reflect that. So we're going to be discussing an article that's popped up on VG247, and we're also going to be going through some of my own opinions and kind of a little bit of analysis of the situation. Because, well, it's quite insane. So as I said, VG247 have an article that's entitled "The Absurdity of Digital Video Game Prices." So in the UK, on average, a digital title is £8.26 more expensive on the PS4 and £9.62 more expensive on the Xbox One. In Germany, you're looking at almost €2 difference on the PS4 and €3 on the Xbox One. France gets absolutely totally screwed over. It's basically €12.51. And for the PS4, and €15.65 on the Xbox One. The only country where it's slightly cheaper, and we are talking 1 cent actually, on average, of course, is in the USA. And as once again, 1 cent, you might as well say they're the same prices for all intents and purposes. In fact, if you were to just do a little bit of your own research, I'll let you do this in your own time. You could see titles are available, for example, Far Cry 4 is available on the PC for like £50 in most areas. You can get digital downloads, sometimes from Uplay, which are a bit cheaper, especially if there are promo prices going on, but the problem is it's still cheaper just to buy the damn thing on Amazon. Now, there are multiple problems I have with this. Now, there's reasons that this is taking place. One of them is definitely the fact that, well, there's profit taking there. On the PC, developers, publishers don't need to pay a royalty fee to basically put titles on the PC platform, but they do have to give percentages to, say, Steam to have it on the Steam front. Now, Steam has its own inherent problems that we could definitely discuss, and this is getting slightly off topic, but I do want to touch on this just for a second, because of all the major criticism that's going on with the Steam platform, primarily with the result of indie games, mostly focused on the fact that, well, there's very little quality control. For example, you can have titles which, quite frankly, are not that great. In fact, sometimes they're just basically using store-bought assets. They've got bugs in them, they crash, they don't work with certain versions of Windows, in other words, the latest versions like Windows 8. And they're often just re-releases of very old titles, and they just plain just aren't as good as what they should be. And yet, Steam has them on there, and to be totally honest, there's very little buyer's protection, which is a massive problem. And yet, the titles are still pretty darn expensive on there, which is, it's not a really good situation. I don't think that's particularly an inherently fair situation for us as gamers. But console owners, it's pretty much the same. Now, the one benefit, of course, consoles traditionally have had over PC, at least in recent years, is that if I buy a copy of a game, let's just say, for example, I bought Gears of War, the original Gears of War on the Xbox 360 when it first came out, which I did, still own it actually, but let's say back in the day, after a week, I was like, you know what, I don't like this game, it sucks, I'm going to trade it in. I could do so and I would get a percentage of money off, and still do it occasionally. PC for console games, if you don't like it, or you're done with it, or whatever, you trade it in. And you've got that prerogative. Or similarly, if you've got a friend by the name of Bob, and Bob hasn't bought the game yet, he has no intention of buying it, he doesn't have the money to buy it, whatever, you can lend that game to Bob. So, although digital is starting to get more generous with the ability to basically lend titles to friends to enable them to play it for a limited amount of time, it's still, for all intents and purposes, it's still a lot more restrictive than what we have the ability to with a physical copy. And of course, the other benefit of a physical copy is that it's saving your internets. In other words, the amount of bandwidth it takes you to download it. I will say that that's coming off the back of someone, myself, who downloaded a 15GB update for Halo the Master Chief Collection. I can actually somewhat forgive that because of the raw, pure amount of bloody content that is on that disc. There are some that would definitely prefer for it to be over 2 discs, and I can understand that point of view. However, personally, I'm actually quite happy with what Microsoft did anyway. One of the real reasons the digital pricing, supposedly, this is from industry sources, and of course we all know how dicey this situation can become, when you listen to sources and it's he said, she said, what they said. But one of the primary reasons it's cited is quite simply because Sony and Microsoft and co have a relationship with big, basically chains, retail chains. They still need them to promote their games. People still want to buy physical copies, and quite simply put, if physical copies were cheap enough, there would be a lot of absurd retailers. I'm not quite sure about that situation, because the problem with that is you're still getting companies like Amazon. I'll just be totally blunt which ones I use. I'm not promoting them. These are just ones that I use personally. So yeah, you might use something else, but I'll use like Green Man Gaming if I'm trying to get Steam codes. I'll sometimes use Amazon. I'll use shop2.net, a couple of others, and they've all got their own retail, discounts, and some are good for like digital titles, for example Steam. Others are better if you want like a physical release, and so on and so on and so on. And they've all got, of course, got different prices, what they can manage to wrangle from distributors or willing to lose. Because obviously if they buy the title, it's just completely basic economics, and I'm sure you probably get this anyway, but they might be able to buy the title for £30, just for example, and they decide, hey, you know what, we feel that if we sell it for £37 rather than $39.99, we can probably shift more copies and, basically outsell our competition, and so that's what they'll do. Pretty obvious, simple stuff. Now, the problem with digital, inherently, we are basically at the mercy of the pricing that's set on PSN or Xbox Live or so on and so forth. And this is one of the reasons, despite my love of Valve software, I actually don't mind Uplay. I actually prefer Origin, and I'll tell you why. It's not because I'm like a massive EA fan, although I do think EA's policies have gotten slightly better. The real reason that I actually prefer Origin over Uplay, I find Uplay's a little sluggish and I don't really like the design, but I would actually get past that and I would say they're about even if Origin didn't have that more robust returns policy. I really like that policy. In case you're not too familiar with it, in a nutshell, it's basically if you buy an Electronic Arts first-party game, so I believe it extends to like BioWare and basically anything under the EA umbrella. I would recommend, however, you do some checking on this before you just take my advice and then rush off and buy like a load of titles. But you could basically return it within a certain amount of time. I believe it's 24 or 48 hours. But it's a nice guarantee, because if you find that the title just runs like crap on your system, if you find that, you know what, I thought this new Battlefield was going to be my thing, but I'm really not feeling it, or whatever the reason, you've got that guarantee, and I quite like that. I think that's a nice little policy, and quite frankly speaking, I wish it was extending to Steam as well. But that's getting slightly off the beaten topic. So I really want developers and publishers to start fixing this issue. One of the problems with modern day gaming on consoles, of course, is we do have to install the title to the bloody hard disk. Now, the size of installation, of course, really depends upon the game. You could get a game that's only got like a 20GB install, or slightly less, all the way up to 30 plus gigabytes, particularly when one is dealing with day one patches. And we all know the day one patches, which, and this is just from my own mental noting, and I've certainly not noted down the size of every sodding patch, But I have noticed, and this is just a random factoid, that the Xbox One Day 1 patches typically are slightly larger than PlayStation 4. That's just from what I've noticed with the games that I've played on Day 1 patches. And once again, your mileage may vary depending on the games that you're playing. It's just kind of an FYI. One of the reasons that they have to install is because the Blu-ray drive that's in the systems isn't really capable of pulling data off fast enough to make loading times, well, acceptable. Now, I don't really have a problem with that personally. Fine, install. I do wish the hard drives were larger, but that's, once again, a slightly different topic. Me point being that digital can be more convenient, but it's not massively more convenient. It can be more convenient in some ways. For example, you can download the title without needing to leave your home, particularly if you can pre-download it and then it unlocks at a specific time. Steam does that, some Xbox Live games do that, PlayStation Network, blah blah blah. That could be kind of cool. So in other words, the title will download over a few days and then the necessary last bits of data, possibly a day one patch, will download on the day that it's released, and then you're pretty much good to go. That's kind of handy because it saves you having to worry, oh crap, is the postman going to come today? Or, oh bollocks, I have to go to the store. And no one likes to go to a store when the game's coming out because, well, frankly, that sucks, especially if you've got work that day. It really blows, and if you don't have work that day, it still blows because then you have to go out on your day off. So digital definitely has its advantages like that. You've got other advantages, of course, too, such as not needing to worry about physical discs and all of that stuff. But really and truly speaking, digital is more convenient in just being able to load a title from the library. Obviously now internet connections are becoming faster, it's quicker to download. For example, on Steam, on my connection pretty much maxes out typically, depending on how busy it is. Steam sales can be a little slower. Generally, however, it will max my connection out at almost 20 megabytes per second, which is not too shabby. Even if the title is 10, 15, 20 gigs, it doesn't take a ridiculous amount of time to basically prepare that game to download and finish, and then finish the quick installation. But on consoles and PC, I mean PC, the main problem, of course, of PC is the fact that we've had piracy. Now, piracy is definitely a major factor. And one of the reasons, of course, that distributors really like that whole... I mean, this is, once again, slightly off the beaten topic, but back in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially when Steam wasn't really a thing, no CD cracks were really quite prevalent. One of the reasons behind that, quite simply put, was because no one wanted to keep bloody putting the disc into the drive. And ironically enough, there were massive issues with this because I believe it was Colin McRae Rally and some other games, I've mentioned this before, they would actually detect certain models of drive, and I'm talking physical drives like DVD drives or CD writers, or even CD-ROM drives at some points in the really early 90s. They would detect those as basically virtual drives, and thus they would not allow the disc to play, which is kind of a problem. So in that respect, I do really like digital. It just kind of no fuss, no muss, and you don't have to keep track of like dozens of different serial numbers as well, which is quite nice. Of course, you do have the problem that, effectively speaking, your account is tied to, well, all of your games. So in other words, if you do happen to do something to piss Valve off or whatever, that can be a problem. And definitely that's a bit of an issue. And that definitely extends to, let's say in 10 years from now, on the consoles. One of the benefits, of course, with the PlayStation 2, just for instance, is the fact that, you know, in 20 years' time, assuming the hardware and the discs haven't been damaged, you can still plug that sucker into your TV, assuming, once again, you've got a connection that, you know, works in 20 years' time. But let's just assume in this magical world, 20 years in the future, that it does have backwards compatibility with standard SCARTs or RGB or whatever. Then you could imagine you could still play that. On the other hand, with digital, does the service really last 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line? Who the hell knows? So, I've gone into some of this stuff previously, and there is definitely some other technical reasons that we could start dipping our feet into. For example, distribution costs as well. Obviously, they do need to pay distribution costs of like digital content. In other words, they have to pay per gigabyte, which many people do overlook. But to be honest with you, the transaction costs of that is actually pretty cheap, particularly when you consider, say, Windows Azure and just how robust and extensive their architecture is. You can go to windowsazure.com and start calculating the prices of, say, the transaction of 20 gigabytes of data, and you can see that it's pretty cheap. And that's for consumers on the first 20 gigabytes. Imagine what it's actually costing Microsoft to start shunting that around the internet. Not too much. So, those points are not as much as, say, physically shipping a game to a distributor. In other words, to send it across the ocean in some cases. The EU is definitely getting screwed over, which isn't particularly new. Even Steam has different prices for different regions, which quite frankly blows. Yes, of course, we do have tax differences in different regions, but this still doesn't really account for that. And you've also got to remember that tax is still payable on retail shipped versions of the titles as well. Furthermore, even if we would take the best case scenario from these findings, which is the United States, in terms of it actually has some level of parity between the digital and physical copy, it's still a parity. We're still not saving anything. And I've got to say that if the future really is digital, something's got to be done. Considering, well, the magnitude of different issues we've got right now, particularly in the United States. I believe you guys have a lot more bandwidth caps than what we do in the United Kingdom. I'm uncertain because I don't live there, but that's just from my initial research and asking a couple of people. It does, obviously the bandwidth caps are reasonable, but even so, the other problem, and this is kind of a final thought, is that retail copies of the titles typically do go on sale a lot quicker. And it's actually a little weird because some physical copies are considerably more expensive and they will remain so for quite some time. I just personally think it sucks because here's the problem with this. In the case of the PC, you're either A, promoting piracy, or B, you're promoting the fact that, quite simply, people are just going to wait for the bloody Steam sale. People just are not willing to pay that amount of cash for a title that they were kind of meh about. Sure, if they're really interested in it, they will, but they won't really want to pay like $50 for a digital, or £50, I mean, for a copy of a game digitally. At least not on average. GOG and of course CD Projekt Red are being a lot more generous with this, and particularly when we start to account for issues such as DLC, which is, yes, I admit, a slightly different topic, but it still starts rearing its head. Titles become really expensive, and it's kind of funny because now you get like a game like Call of Duty, and immediately after you've bought the bloody thing, you're getting advertisements for the season pass. Are you serious? It's like, I don't know. Gaming's always been pretty expensive, and anyone that tells you it's not doesn't really have a memory. I mean, I remember back in the day of the cartridge of the N64 in the UK, I believe it was £70 for Torok. And I believe like Super Mario was $59.99 when it was released in the UK. But there was a thing for that. It was actually a physical cartridge, and those things were expensive as hell to produce, even for small amounts of memory. This was actually somewhat off topic once again, but it was actually one of the reasons that Sony managed to get Squaresoft as a developer, and Square left and abandoned effectively creating Final Fantasies for the N64 because they realised the prohibitive costs for the cartridges and the fact that the cartridges just wouldn't have enough space on them. In other words, they just knew it wasn't really a particularly good idea. Bit of a problem there. But anyway, I digress once again, as I tend to do so. So now that shouldn't really be a problem. If you look at the costs of digital distribution, we expect prices to start going down a little bit, and obviously games development costs are increasing as well. But the problem is there's still that disconnect in pricing. So it's like I don't feel there should be a parity. I feel digital should be a bit cheaper. As I said, the primary reason for this, ignoring the PC platform, because I think it's a little bit more unique because we've had digital for so long now. But the trade-off, of course, with PC is, yes, digital's been there, but it's also been cheaper. Now, ironically enough, it's getting to the point where it's still cheaper to just buy the bloody physical disc, then use the sodding code on Steam, which is just absolutely ludicrous in my personal opinion. And I can see a couple of instances where that's the case. Just doing a quick search on Amazon for either games that are on Steam or games that are on Uplay or whatever. And then finally, of course, we've got the consoles, and you can't trade the game in and so on. Basically what I'm saying is the situation just completely and utterly sucks, and despite the fact that there have been numerous attempts by publishers and developers and Sony and Microsoft and blah 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 to explain this, the situation is still quite frankly crap. So it could be explained, but the answers are not really what we're hoping for. So anyway, I've rambled for some time, and I think I've just about covered all the points. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, or found it somewhat, I don't know, thought-provoking, dare I say. But take care, and bye for now.